found pretty much every book on Jinnah and read it. And it became an obsession. And for the longest time, it was an obsession. Why the only politician to be called the best ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity went, basically 180 degrees on his principles and stood for a separate Pakistan. Whether we are going to be secular or theocratic, are we going to be an Islamic republic? What does the Islamic republic mean? What is the role of minorities in this country? Does the state get to decide who's a Muslim or who's not? That, kind of hit close to home because I did have Ahmadi family members, and I saw their plight and it was really upsetting. So all of those questions, I think, can be answered if...
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Today to speak on the life of Jinnah, who ended up changing the entire fate of the subcontinent, I have with me a biographer and a lawyer who knows Jinnah quite very close. My guest today, you might have guessed it right, it's Yaser Latif Hamdani. Yaser, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you.
All right, Yaser, now before I go ahead and speak about your book that you recently wrote on Jinnah, I want to go ahead and basically speak about your health ordeal that you went through. And I must, at the very outset, also apologize that since we've known each other for about 9 years, it sort of came as a surprise and a shock to me, that since we were not in touch, I have not kept in contact during that. While I do apologize, I was completely taken aback. After your wife, Aisha, had actually written that piece, which got subsequently published in Dawn, as well as, in the Indian publication Scroll. It was quite very shocking to see what you had actually endured. Could you tell us, or sort of walk us through what really happened and how did you sort of overcome that entire challenge? And how did your family, your better half, Aisha, sort of, helped you through this entire process?
I think, one goes through such challenges. It's inevitable that some of us would ultimately go through something like this in life. Of course, it was a right temporal lobe tumor, which was, quite life-threatening and stuff. And I went through 2 surgeries, both of them awake. So that was the surgery. When it was happening, I could see my brain and everything.
And to sort of specify this, when did this like really first come to your attention or to your family's attention that you have something, as life-threatening as this?
So in 2017, I collapsed in the gym and had a seizure. And that's when they diagnosed, through an MRI and a CT scan, they diagnosed that there was a tumor sitting in my right temporal lobe. And that's when I first had my surgery. This was in October 2017. And then I had a second surgery, a subsequent surgery that was in 2020. And then, of course, I went through chemo and radio. So it was, it was hard. I was, pretty much bedridden for a couple of years. But yeah, in terms of, I thought I take it as a character building experience. I did a number of things when I was, I don't want to toot my own horn.
But go ahead and sort of walk us through
Yeah, but one of the things that I did during, of course, I wrote this book. This was, the Jinnah book came through this. I did a fellowship at Harvard on the question of minorities' rights under the Pakistani constitution. And there was a paper that came out of that. So there was that and this. And then at a very late stage of my legal career, I decided that I would want to do the bar from London. And so I did that as well. So I thought it was a very productive period in that sense. I was suddenly this idea had kind of grasped me, where I thought that I had very little time and I needed to do all of these things. Of course, the second surgery was a supratotal resection. So my doctor says I'm pretty much cured, for now, at least. So, things did turn out for the better in the end. Of course, one had to sort of compromise on a number of things. It was harder for my wife and my family, my mother, my kids, but especially for my wife. I think, she was thrust into this role of a caregiver, and she was pretty much battling these odds. I mean, first surgery, around that time, she had some help from my mother and stuff. But the second surgery, we had to it was during COVID. My mother couldn't travel, and somebody had to stay home with the kids, of course.
Yeah, and it was quite a difficult period for both of you, for your wife, who was the primary caregiver, and also for you as well.
Yeah, so we traveled across Pakistan to go to Karachi because there were no flights.
Yeah.
And the surgery had to happen in Karachi because...
And how did you guys commute then?
Through well, it was a rented car.
So yeah, and you were traveling by car, and then...
Yeah, and I got that opportunity of seeing all of Sindh and all of that, So I was, this was a couple of days before I went in for my second surgery. So it was an extraordinary time given COVID, and but we did it. And I remember the second surgery being more gruesome in terms of the pain. The first surgery, because what they do, this is an extraordinary surgery, by the way. I mean, they basically the anesthesia is applied to your head, so you're actually awake throughout.
So it's not a general anesthesia. I mean,
no, it's not.
It's kind of like a localized anesthesia that they're administering on you.
And the reason for that is that if they they have to keep talking to you so that they don't accidentally cut off something that you need. Like the optical nerve or something. So they're talking to you constantly. So the first surgery, I remember all 7 hours, I had a long discussion about various issues with the, with various political, cultural, historical issues with the team there.
Wow.
The second one, though, was more painful. The first one, I didn't feel that badly about. So,
Yasir, like, what really inspired you at the end of the day? Sort of push yourself and say that I'm not going to give up, come what may. And this is something that Aisha also writes in that piece also, that your resilience at sort of keeping and pushing yourself forward in terms of the kind of challenges that you were facing back then. What did you really do to make sure that you're not going to give up, and you're sort of going to go ahead and stick to what you're doing and not be distracted by this unseen challenge that you were confronted with?
Right. I think there's so let's talk about the surgery itself. I think a major part of me sort of being able to get over the recovery period, the convalescence, as it were. I would have to give credit to Jinnah to a certain extent, or maybe most of it, other than the fact, of course, my wife was such a pillar of support, that goes without saying. So, but in terms of that motivation, I've often found, and maybe it sounds cliched, maybe it sounds, a bit full, but, I'm being earnest when I say that throughout my life, I've been buoyed by the idea of Jinnah. This idea that, so just before I went in for my first surgery, and this is literally 15 minutes before they were going to, not 15 minutes, just maybe 5 minutes before they were going to roll me in to the surgery, and I was on that stretcher, and I was still on my phone. I was just looking through my phone, and I got an email from Kanishka Gupta of India. And he's like, we want to know if you're available to write a biography of Mr. Jinnah.
Wow.
We would be very interested in pitching it. I looked at it. This was like 5 minutes before I was going into this potentially fatal surgery. There was a high chance that I wouldn't make it.
Wow.
So I wrote back to him. I was like, if I'm going into surgery right now, and I'm going to find out in 7 hours if I'm going to live or die. But if I live, I'll write the book. So I think, and the reason for that, I, want to, so I am someone who's, for most of my life, and I'm going to be very candid about things in this interview, most of my life, I've craved this idea of identity, I grew up in, a generally, I would say, generally privileged background there was. But one of the things was that I come from a very mixed religious family. I have people who are Sunnis in the family, there are Shias, and there are Ahmadis as well, So when I went to the US and I was studying for my undergrad at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and one of the things, of course, when you're living abroad, you obviously come across Indians, and Indians become your friends, and then you have all these arguments and debates. And I had a very, very close friend who's like a brother to me. We used to debate, partition, and argue about Jinnah, Gandhi, Nehru, etc. for the longest time. So there was that inspiration. But it was also, so because of those arguments, I started going to the library. And the great thing about US universities is you can pretty much find any book.
Yeah.
So I found pretty much every book on Jinnah and read it, And it became an obsession. And for the longest time, it was an obsession. Whatever books were left, I bought them and, read them later. I realized that the man had a certain vision, and it's one thing to narrowly sort of reduce him to a Muslim leader, but his idea, his life was a very inspirational one, which unfortunately no one's quite written about it, or I've tried to write about it, where I've tried to explain why the only politician to be called the best ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, and who for 30 out of 40 years of his political career used to call himself for Indian first, second, and last. Why was it that this man went, basically 180 degrees on his principles and stood for a separate Pakistan? And that question was very important. But it was not just important because to me as a Pakistani, who's trying to understand partition or trying to understand independence and the reasons for making of Pakistan. But it is also important to explore that because of the perennial identity issues that this country has had, whether we are going to be secular or theocratic, are we going to be an Islamic republic? What does the Islamic republic mean? What is the role of minorities in this country? Does the state get to decide who's a Muslim or who's not? That, kind of hit close to home because I did have Ahmadi family members, and I saw their plight and it was really upsetting. So all of those questions, I think, can be answered if we go back to Jinnah. So I have always been, just to answer your question, I'm sorry I've digressed. I have felt that answering these questions and bringing Jinnah, at least how I understand him, to the forefront, can help resolve some of those problems. So in my opinion, this book that I wrote and this entire sort of, this endeavor, as it were, was a political act. While I did it academically and, it was well received and, there were, very generous comments from across the border as well, describing it to be a very balanced but it was nevertheless a political act. You asked me if I should call myself a historian. I do see myself as a lawyer of, who's trying to sift through, it was, the thing that the other inspiration I had was H.M.C. Rvai's. H.M.C. Rvai was this great Indian lawyer, constitutional lawyer, who wrote this book on Constitution of India, in which he had an introduction, and that was later put out as Partition of India, Legend and Reality. I think my role is of that lawyer looking at the facts and doing the due diligence of partition and Jinnah especially, and showing what he actually stood for. So those things have always sort of buoyed me.
And so speaking of, what he has really stood for, I want to sort of draw your attention to this least or perhaps least appreciated facts, because Jinnah, as we know, he's quite, renowned as among when we speak of the popular opinion, he's known as the lawyer, the legislator, the founder of Pakistan. But I want to sort of pick your mind in terms of what has his legacy been, towards the subcontinent itself, and that does not include Pakistan only. What has his overall legacy been, if you can sort of like walk us through some of his achievements?
Certainly. I think this is a very important question, because one of the things I realized, and it actually, when I was writing this book, like I said, I was at Harvard doing a fellowship, and that's where it started. There was an Indian historian, a legal historian, who came to speak at Harvard Law School. Her name was Mitra Sharafi. Now, she started her talk. It was the title of the talk was the Supreme Court of India. It was called Supreme. And she started off, and she's like, one of the, sort of lesser known figures was this dynamic Bombay barrister, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was one of the earliest proponents of having an Indian Supreme Court. And so I went and I looked at the debates, and yes, he is the first Indian legislator to say, listen, we don't want to send our appeals to Privy Council in London, as good as the Privy Council might be, but they don't understand the context. So our appeals should go to an Indian Supreme Court. And so Jinnah was one of the earliest people, probably the first person to moot this idea of an Indian Supreme Court. So that's something that, is extraordinary. It should be popularized, because, that's quite an achievement. Similarly, one of the other unknown, or lesser known facts is that the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun was founded majorly because of the efforts of Mr. Jinnah. He was the first one to turn to the British and say, listen, you want us to fight your wars, the First World War and so on and so forth, but we want officer status in the army. We cannot be cannon fodder. And so it was Jinnah's efforts which got this idea. He was, of course, there were others, but Jinnah was a main character in getting this idea that there should be an Indianization of the officer corps in the Indian army. Before that, there were no Indian officers. And then this idea that, yes, sure, the officers can study in Sandhurst in London, in England, but no, we need a local military academy to train the officer corps. And that's what happened. The Indian Dehradun Academy, owes a lot to Jinnah himself, and which is something that people on both sides of the border are reticent. They don't want to accept this fact. But Jinnah is not only, one could argue he's also the father of the Indian Supreme Court, as well as being the father of the Indian Military Academy. So I think, so if we look at that, then we talk about, stop me when I'm, sort of going over or whatever, but, just to talk about other things. For example, the Child Marriages Restraint Act, the Sarda Bill was this massive piece of legislation that came in and immediately drew the ire of both Hindu orthodoxy and Muslim orthodoxy. Now, even Gandhi, for example, opposed it. He said no. He said, even though he had written against child marriage and so on, supposedly, but he said, no, the government measures I disapprove. But Jinnah came out strongly in favor of the Sarda Bill. He's the one who drafted clauses of it, sections of it, and then he's the one who piloted it through the Indian legislature. So that is significant, right? If you think about it. And one of the things he said, and this is, in my opinion, the most inspirational quote that I've seen a popular politician. He's when he was being questioned, there was like rioting by Muslims and Hindus against that. There was a lot of pressure, and he's like, if my constituency is not advanced enough to approve of this measure that I'm forwarding, then they should elect someone else, because this is what I'm going to stand for. So this idea of, he was not just a follower of popular whim, as it were, but he was also this person who knew when to lead. So I think, that is significant. A lot of work that he did in the Indian legislature was significant. He stood for women's rights. I imagine, before Jinnah famously said, no nation can rise to the heights of glory unless your women are side by side you. And then he went on to say that we are victims of evil customs. The fact of the matter is, you take out the Pakistan movement from the equation, there wouldn't be a Muslim women's rights movement. There was, of course, an Indian Hindu sort of women's rights movement, but Muslim women by and large were alienated from politics, there were very few educated Muslim women. Jinnah is the one who brought them into politics and into the public life. So that, I think, is significant. And then going back to, the question of religious freedom, it's unfortunate what we've done to his Pakistan, but one of the key sort of planks of his political struggle was this idea of religious freedom, where you pick up the 14 points, you pick up any of his documents, then of course you have the 11th August speech, and 33 other speeches that I've counted from 1947 alone, which talk about equality of citizenship and the idea that a person's religious belief should be protected, and that there shouldn't be any compulsion, and that, the state should not be bothered by what a person's faith is. This is something that Jinnah stood for. Most importantly, and this is where I connected to the other sort of work that I've done, in 1944, by and large, there was the Ahmadi issue, and I hope we can talk about it. The Ahmadi issue had been flaring up in the 30s, Majlis-e-Ehrarul Islam, which was a Congress-backed, Gandhi and Nehru had been supporting it, Congress-backed religious organization, had been starting, these sectarian issues. Started it in Lucknow against the Shias, then started it against the Ahmadis in Punjab and so on. They had been pressurizing Jinnah to turn out the Ahmadis from the Muslim League. Jinnah refused. He just said no. He's like, he said that, these sectarian questions don't interest me. And he said that he's no one to declare someone a non-Muslim if they call themselves a Muslim. Now that is such a significant statement. He's the only Muslim political leader to have said it so clearly. Remember, Iqbal had been arguing the other way, So I think in terms of this idea of self-identification, of religious freedom, of women's rights, of freedom of speech and expression, the work that he did against the press act that came out, the support that he gave B.G. Horniman of Bombay Chronicle, the work that he did for Tilak when Tilak was accused of sedition. So Jinnah, as a lawyer and politician, has this extraordinary legacy, which is all forgotten because all our textbooks, and for that matter, India's as well, focus on those 7 years where he was fighting for Pakistan.
Now, I want to sort of draw your attention to the question of Pakistan itself. When you look at a lot of commentators today, they say Pakistan would have inevitably happened because, the Imperial British back then were exhausted after the two world wars. And, Pakistan coming into being was sort of like a writing on the wall. How much do you sort of agree or disagree with that statement? And where do you think, the agency of individuals or leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah come into play?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I think that Jinnah is the one who crafted a Muslim nation, you know. And here I must also add, before I go on, that it was not a theocentric idea of a nationhood. You know, if you look at his famous speech where he articulates the two nation theory, he talks about culture, architecture, names, history. He doesn't talk about religious belief. So this idea of a Muslim was so all encompassing. You know, it was not about theology, it was not about religion, it was Islam ontologically emptied, you know. But he's the one who crafted this big tent Muslim community, as it were, Muslim community into nation. The idea was to have a consociational solution for the subcontinent. It was in part a reaction to what was seen as popularization or the Hindu-centric idea of Indian nationhood that had been developing from the 1870s onwards. Without Jinnah, bringing Muslims of the majority areas and the Muslims of minority areas, you know, as in where Muslims were a minority and Muslims were a majority, bringing them together under one flag was an impossible undertaking. But it was Jinnah who managed to do that alone, you know. Now, there is a lot of debate about the final shape that he had in mind. You know, that I think we can discuss, or you'd probably ask me about. But I think that while the final shape is something that can be debated and discussed, but without Jinnah, the Muslims would never have united the way they did. And he did so because he kept the idea of Muslim nationhood as all-encompassing. You know, he didn't reduce it to this theology or that theology. And the fact that Jinnah was, you know, not known to be particularly religious was actually something that worked in his favor. You know, he was not associated with this sect or that sect or this group, you know, and people instinctively came to him. So I mean, while great man theory of history is problematic, but I do see Jinnah as this epoch-making character that, you know, without him, he was probably the most important of all the characters. If you look at the various things, there were so many people in Congress, you know, who could carry the mantle. Gandhi wasn't even a member of the Congress. You know, there were people on the British side who were, you know, Wavell and Mountbatten and so on and so forth. But when you look at Muslim side, and I'll quote Jawaharlal Nehru on this, you know, Jawaharlal Nehru, who disliked Jinnah for many reasons, or at least was not a political supporter, you can imagine, described Jinnah in his book Discovery of India as someone who had no lure of office, as opposed to others who did, and who basically said that Jinnah was well advanced of any Muslim in the subcontinent. So he said he stood head and shoulders above everyone else in the Muslim League and the Muslim community. That was precisely the reason that he alone could have brought. And this is Nehru writing, who's a critic of Jinnah. Similarly, Ambedkar writes about Jinnah. He says Jinnah was the only politician to whom the word incorruptible could be fittingly applied in the subcontinent. Now he's, you know, including all of them and saying Jinnah was the only one. He also said that Jinnah represented the transformation of this ideal in the Muslim community. So he was sort of the you know, that figure who was the master signifier of this Muslim identity, this new Muslim identity that was coming to fore. So yeah, so to answer your question, I think Jinnah at least had a massive role to play.
And speaking of the cabinet mission itself in the 1946, how difficult of a negotiating process was it, and where do you think Jinnah's role sort of came in terms of, you know, making the unachievable achievable through his negotiating skills, you know, through his ability to sort of, you know, steer through those difficult conversations and those difficult processes like that?
I think Jinnah was a master negotiator. You know, and maybe that was his legal training, but you know, especially with the cabinet mission plan, what he was about to achieve, and what, you know, others like Azad, etc., were also supporting, was this consociational united India, which would not be majoritarian in nature, but would rather have two hostile majorities coming together in a hostile majorities, because Muslims are in majority in certain regions, coming together in a contractual arrangement. Only Jinnah could have achieved that. And the cabinet mission plan, if it had delivered, would have delivered a Pakistan. This is the problem with a lot of people who look at, you know, so for example, you know, people who criticize Aisha Jalal, they're like, you know, she's saying bargaining counter and that's so on and so forth. Aisha Jalal doesn't use the word bargaining counter. When Jinnah said Pakistan, he meant Pakistan. But what form what relationship would that Pakistan have with the rest of India was something that was open throughout, and Jinnah did not want to sever the connection. Apologize.
Please, you can take water, you can sip as much coffee as you like in between the conversation. Make yourself feel at home, please.
Yeah, so that final relationship between Pakistan and the rest of India, one of the things that Jinnah was adamant about, he was deadly opposed to the new India that was coming after partition to adopt the name India. He said there can't be an India without Pakistan. You know, he famously said that. The thing is that he had this idea of India above Hindustan and Pakistan. You know, he saw two dominions and he saw this over. So Jinnah was open to this idea of a federation between Muslim majority areas and Hindu majority areas. That was one solution. Or a confederation, as in there would be two federations, Hindu and Muslim majority federations, but they would come together as a confederation. That was the other. And the third was treaty relations. So, you know, some sort of a treaty relationship between Pakistan and India based on what was later. No, at the time there wasn't a European Union, but the idea that European Union ultimately embodied is what Jinnah had been imagining for Pakistan and India, or Pakistan or Hindustan. He used to say Hindustan. Pakistan and Hindustan before then. So I think that is where, you know, the argument, I mean, only Jinnah, a master negotiator, could actually see that having a cabinet mission plan, and he had to convince his followers after he accepted the cabinet mission plan. He was under immense pressure again. People were like, you've been arguing for Pakistan and now you're giving it up. But that wasn't what he was doing. His idea of Pakistan was not predicated on partition of India. He did not see closed borders. You know, he ultimately, the most it could have been was a Canada-US type relationship. So I to answer your question, his negotiation skills, you know, I would hope that at some point some management guru or someone would write a book on Jinnah's, you know, marketing, negotiation, you know, etc., of how he planned and, you know, how he strategized. I think that would be a great book to write. Somebody should write it.
And now, speaking of, you know, the Jinnah after the creation of Pakistan itself, you know, he's come under a lot of criticism for having dismissed the government in then the northwestern frontier province's provincial government. If you look at it in the hindsight today, do you think the decision was right? Or do you think the Governor General back then could have done things differently? He could have adopted some alternative path in terms of going forward with that political crisis that he had at his hand?
Yeah, I think the political crisis that is often not mentioned, there was this, I'll be honest about it. One, obviously, when elected government gets dismissed, there's this idea, of that being an undemocratic move. But he was not left with many options. One of the key decisions that were taken between the governing council, as it were, before partition, was that on 14th August 1947, the sorry, I'm
no, take your time.
So on 14th August 1947, the Khan Saab ministry in what was then NWFP would resign. And the reason for that was it had lost a popular referendum, one. Two, after the news, there were people who were moving out of then Northwest Frontier Province. Ultimately, Congress government or the KK government in NWFP would have lost its majority. So, they had lost the rationale after the referendum. The rationale in a parliamentary democracy, a popular defeat like that means the government has to go. So there was that. Give me 1 minute.
Sure.
I don't know what's happening. Something's
amiss with the throat.
No, it's not. It's something that's, sort of bothering me. I don't know. So I was saying, so the Congress government would have lost its majority anyway. But that was not all. On 30th of July in 1947, the Khudai Khidmatgars and the Congress Parliamentary Party met in Bannu. Now this is on record. And they passed a resolution. And this was maybe like less than 1.5 months before the division was to happen and, independence had to come. They mooted this idea, and this should give anyone pause. They said that they wanted a Pakhtunistan on the Islamic conception, which would be an independent state. And, that was in violation of the agreement that was made between Congress, government, the government of India and Muslim League. This idea of, and so from the get-go, the Congress government in NWFP was planning this separation. So there was no way a new government that was being formed was going to allow someone who's not, or at least the Khan ministry at this time did not take an oath to Pakistan. So given that it would lose...
And this meeting had actually taken place after the referendum had been conducted and people had actually voted in favor of joining Pakistan.
Yes.
All right.
And this is on record, and it was the blatant use, the Bannu resolution was significant because Congress, which had been calling itself secular, and KK, of course, the Khudai Khidmatgars as well, saying Congress and the Khudai Khidmatgar, who were supposed to be secular, were resorting to a religious appeal. They were saying it's going to be an Islamic conception, and that's what's going to be Pakhtunkhwa. Now, if you link it up to what they were doing with Fakir of Ippi, Fakir of Ippi had announced a jihad against Pakistan. And he had said that Pakistan is an un-Islamic state. It's British in nature, and that we would start a jihad. Now, Fakir of Ippi and Badshah Khan and Dr. Khan Saab were all in contact. So what I'm trying to say is that a government like that could not have been tolerated by a new state. I mean, it goes without saying such a government would have posed grave threat to the new state. So I think that was kind of inevitable. And the act, there was... So section 51(5), under which it was dismissed, the provincial legislature was not dismissed. Contrary to some of the people who probably don't know enough, they assume that the provincial legislature was dismissed. That was never dismissed. The assembly was not dissolved, contrary to, sort of the myth, as it were. The government was removed under Section 51(5), and a new government was brought in, which had to win a vote of confidence, which it did. So there, I think the answer is that it was a constitutional move born out of necessity. And I think, looking back at it, in my opinion, it was the right thing to do. That doesn't mean Jinnah didn't go wrong on so many other occasions. He was, after all, a human being. But in this particular case, I see why he had to do it.
Right. And now, speaking of another instant, or may I say, a couple of other instances where he decided to represent two different people, including, Bhagat Singh, and also Sibghatullah Rashidi VI, who's famously known in Sindh as Surya Badshah. Why do you think Jinnah had actually decided to represent these two very people who were so openly dissenting and also, acting or engaging in violent acts against the imperial British government? What do you think was it sort of telling you about, or what did it sort of tell about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, both as a lawyer and about his values? Or do you think, was it merely a political act that he decided to, represent these two very people who were in a way anti-imperialist?
I think Jinnah instinctively was anti-imperialist, since 1904 when he joins the Congress party. I don't buy this, new fad that, they want to paint Jinnah as pro-imperialist. I don't think he was pro-imperialist. I think he was anti-imperialist, and by that I mean that while he did not, so he wanted the subcontinent to be an independent self-governing dominion like Australia or Canada. Mm-hmm. Now, he was willing to not sever the British connection, but he saw that the British bureaucracy itself, the way it governed India, was done to the exclusion of the people. Mm-hmm. Now, with Bhagat Singh, Jinnah says, in his famous speech in the Indian legislature, he says that he doesn't share, or at least he would not resort to the methods. But he understands why people people like Bhagat Singh are doing what they're doing. Because the government, he says, has left them no option. They've been driven to this idea where, and he talks about, most notably, he talks about Ireland in that speech. So he says that the people are riled up, and this is a normal reaction, and then, of course, he praises Bhagat Singh and says, that he, because he had gone on a hunger strike, he defends the idea that, such a prisoner would be a political prisoner. So what it shows is this deep-seated, sort of faith, this idea of rule of law and justice, because what Jinnah actually is attacking in that speech is a criminal law amendment which would have taken away Bhagat Singh's right to appear in court while he was being, whether he was under trial. Or for that matter, he would have been force-fed. So I think that Jinnah on the Bhagat Singh issue definitely was, it spoke to his lifelong commitment to civil liberties and this idea of political protest that he was in favor of. Now, while he believed that there were better ways of doing things, but he was okay with those people who had taken this route, because he thought the British didn't leave them any option. And that's the same in Sindh as well. And, there was later on, he represented Hurs, of course. I don't know if you know that. So I think Jinnah himself was instinctively anti-imperialist.
Right. And now, speaking of one of the political leaders, and this has to do with Britain itself, and I'm speaking of Churchill, someone who's known to have held, South Asia, or perhaps, he was rather more indifferent towards the subcontinent itself. He'd actually, hold the region more in content than show any passion or interest for it. What do you think sort of happened when he met Jinnah and sort of had this change of heart where he started considering the Muslims in subcontinent not as a minority that could have been ignored, and rather said that the Muslims actually numbered 90 million then, and the Muslim League represented a majority. What do you think really happened after he met Jinnah back then?
I think Churchill was a very astute observer of things. Now there were problems, there are problems with Churchillian legacy, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
But on this, he took a very principled position. He said, when you have 90 million people and they are a solid block of people in certain areas, how can you call them a minority? They are a nation. Now, he was endorsing what Jinnah had, basically said to him at Chartwell. I believe they met in London, in England. So the discussion, I think it was Jinnah's persuasion. Now, because of, sort of what Churchill said, people have now tried to ascribe like an imperial motive to the partition of India, which is not true. By and large, the British wanted to leave a united India, and they tried in 1946 with the Cabinet Mission Plan to do precisely that. They wanted to keep Indian Army united. They wanted to keep India united. So I obviously discount the British perfidy, or the perfidious Albion, as they call them. I don't accept that theory at all. I think Churchill's point of view was borne out by fact, and has been borne out by fact, several times over. Now, just because Churchill might have had some rather unfortunate views about, Indians and so on and so forth, that's a separate issue. But yeah, I mean, just to speak to what you are saying, I think, of course, the endorsement by Churchill is something that has been used by people who criticize the idea of Pakistan, saying, look, Churchill is the one who actually wanted to divide India because of his post-war objectives. I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that. And now, let me bring your attention to, Jinnah's personal aspect. And the least appreciated of them is the role of the women, particularly women that were associated with him, that had that, profound impact in his life. But when you actually look at his personality, or the way it is projected out in the popular media, he's sort of, shown as this lone soul figure, single-handedly articulating, this political reality in form of Pakistan. What do you really want to say when it actually comes to his, the relationship with different women in his life, and the impact that they actually had on his personality and him becoming that political leader eventually?
I think the role of women in his life was very significant. Of course, one can talk about his mother and sort of, but, obviously that was a short-lived association. I think he was about 16 or 17 when she died. He was abroad. His first wife, Amy Bai, was very young. He was very young. So that didn't go. But when it comes to two women especially, as a matter of fact, three, I would include his daughter as well, Dina.
Now, what about his aunt as well?
Yeah, and the one who put him up, and all of these people had formative influence. But the two women, I think, who were the most important in his life, and whose roles can be marked certain eras in his life, were Ratti, the wife, and Fatima, the sister. Now, there is a school of thought, which believes that had Ratti lived, Jinnah would not have gone over to the Muslim cause, that he would remain he would have remained in the Indian nationalist fold, as it were. Similarly, I believe that Fatima Jinnah, throughout those last two decades, was definitely, because Jinnah himself was not particularly bothered about religious identity, as it were. It's well known. But it was Fatima Jinnah who was like asking him to talk about Muslims, to, speak for Muslims. He was the one who was, very religious, Shia, Muslim. I definitely think that without Fatima Jinnah's, sort of prodding, he might not have gone the extra mile towards speaking for the Muslims. So in my opinion, the Indian nationalist phase is kind of colored by Ratti's time. And when Ratti dies, he's obviously distraught. And that's when his parting of the ways comes with the Congress as well. And on the other hand, Fatima Jinnah was this inspiration that, was behind him, with him, together with him. And what we have to see is the Jinnah's approach to women was very, very modern. I mean, he put Fatima Jinnah into a convent school in about 1902 or 3 or 4, I think. That was unheard of. I mean, here was a conservative Ismaili young woman being put into a convent school. That was a major no-no, and Jinnah said no. And then he educated her. Then he sent her to dental school. All of those things that he did. Again, that was Jinnah. So this idea of women's empowerment, because remember, one of the things that's forgotten is that when Jinnah when he was in London as a student, was a major supporter of the suffragette movement, the right to vote for women. Jinnah was actually a major supporter. When he died, Agatha Harrison, she was a Quaker and she was also someone who had been intimately involved with the suffragette movement, actually said this at a reference. He's like, he used to come to us when it was extremely unpopular. So Jinnah himself, when it came to women, he realized, as he famously said, the 2 quotes, the no nation can rise to the heights of glory unless your women are side by side you. And also he said that there are 2 powers in the world. One is the pen and the other is the sword. But mightier than the pen and the sword is the woman. She is definitely mightier. And, the reasons he gave is because she, basically she can craft a nation. So, just to circle back to what I said earlier, I think Jinnah's impact on bringing Muslim women out of seclusion, out of parda, and into politics, into mainstream, into these walks of life that they weren't, is something that, in my opinion, I would say that there's a feminist dimension to the Pakistan movement that is not explored,
or in Jinnah's personality and leadership.
Exactly. And that's precisely because of, because he was very clear. I mean, on 25th August 1947, he gave this interview to Collier's Weekly. And they asked him about, how women should be in parda and so on. And he said it clearly. He's like, he said that parda is not mandated by Islam. And whether he was right or wrong is a separate issue. And he said that in the modern state, there is no need because women and men are equal. And we see them as equals. Now, I wonder what Mr. Jinnah would have made of Pakistan with its changes to Qanun-e-Shahadat order or the Evidence Act in 1980s when General Zia changed it, made women half witnesses and so on and so forth. I mean, that works cross purposes, is completely contrary to what Jinnah stood for. It was just, yeah.
Right. And now, before we conclude our conversation, my last question to you is, Yaser, and this has to do with, your role in petitioning the judiciary to get YouTube opened back in 2015, if I have it correctly. And now once again, as we, try and walk through between, the shutdowns and, the kind of reopening of Twitter now and then, you once again petitioned Islamabad High Court to have the platform opened up again. What does it sort of tell us about you and also your passion for Jinnah? And why are you interested in, getting the platforms unbanned?
I think freedom of expression and speech, of course, was something that Jinnah stood for very passionately. I think it is very, the kind of Pakistan that Jinnah had in mind, the kind of state and society that he wanted. I see some of these sort of bans and arbitrary blocks of websites like the YouTube, for example, as completely,
as well as X.com
and X.com as well. It militates against Jinnah's vision, or Jinnah's struggle. So I think, yes, Jinnah has a major role to play, in these petitions, I think, and I've quoted him at length in some of them. But also, I do other work as well, mostly around religious minorities. Again, like I said earlier, I think Jinnah is this original fountain of inspiration that I have, and I drink from it from time to time, So I think, when I do these things, I mean, this is, to put it in a certain way, the work that one does in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, these fundamental rights enumerated by our constitution, one does it for king and country, or Jinnah and country, whatever you want to say. Whereas one does, bread and butter work elsewhere. I think that inspiration, that thing, I definitely draw from Jinnah, So I hope that makes sense. But I think, we kind of, as Pakistanis, owe it to him, because on 11th August, when he gave his famous 11th August speech, one of the things he said was that in his view, this was the right thing to do, as in make Pakistan. But he said that whether that view is wrong, whether they're right or wrong, is something that remains to be seen. He famously says this. He leaves the door open, the question mark. I think we have to prove him right. In order to do that, we have to be the best that we can be, in terms of living closer to their ideology. In my opinion, Pakistan has to hark back to Jinnah and his vision, without which I believe there can't be any progress, because he is the master signifier. He is this deep rooted structure of our identity. And there are a lot of people, I'll tell you, who want to cut down this banyan tree. Jinnah is the banyan tree of our identity, or, maybe the deodar, whichever you want to sort of say. I think this banyan tree of our identity, a lot of people want to cut it down, And that's what, I believe, at least I see myself both as a lawyer and as a biographer, writer, etc. I see myself as safeguarding that banyan tree.
And before I conclude, if you end up winning the petition, you're going to be dedicating this to Jinnah.
Of course.
All right. On that note, Yaser, thank you so much for being part of our conversation today on InferTalks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Mr. Yaser Latif Hamdani. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.